In September of 2016, a field director from the Dunning County Agricultural Co-op drove his clean white pickup down Vera Holst's gravel lane and told her, with genuine sympathy and a folder of market projections, he said it the way a doctor says something irreversible, not unkindly but without room for argument. Her Narragansett bronze crosses all, 140 of them, moving slow and deliberate across the rotational pasture behind him, were not what the market needed. The market needed broad-breasted whites, the fast-growing commercial bird that reached slaughter weight in 16 weeks and held a locked contract price of 88 cents a pound live. Vera stood with her hands in the pockets of her canvas jacket and looked at the birds and said she'd think about it. Dale Marsh drove back out the lane and did not look convinced. By July of 2023, Vera Holst's phone had started ringing in the summer. Not in October, not in the weeks before Thanksgiving when everyone remembered they wanted a bird, but in July, 4 months early, because chefs in Omaha and Kansas City and Lincoln had learned that if they did not call Vera Holst before the monarchs flew through Nebraska, there would be nothing left to reserve. 86 birds placed by September. The waiting list for the following year started the same week. If you have known someone who was right when everyone else was comfortable and wrong, you may already sense the shape of what happened between that September afternoon in 2016 and those July phone calls. This is the story of the years in between. Vera was 67 years old and had worked the same 80 acres in Dunning County for nearly 4 decades, which was something, though not the most important thing. She was known around the county for 2 things: a silence that people sometimes mistook for stubbornness, and a flock of heritage turkeys that she treated less like livestock and more like a working argument she was quietly making. The argument had been started by her mother. To understand Vera, you had to understand the farm itself, which was a place that did not look, at first glance, like much. The main house sat back from the county road, behind a windbreak of Osage orange that her grandfather had planted in 1939, and that had grown into a dense, thorny wall that broke the northwest wind with a sound like running water. The equipment shelter held a 20-year-old tractor, a hay rake, and the portable electric netting reels she used for her turkey rotation, neatly wound and stacked on wooden pegs her father had installed. The smokehouse at the back of the yard, limestone built and black, with a century of wood smoke, had not been in use for curing since Ingrid's time, but Vera kept it swept, and the door hinges oiled the way you keep something you may want to return to. The property looked to the eye of a man from the co-op with a clipboard and a comparison chart, like a farm that had not kept pace. To Vera, it looked like a farm that had not borrowed more than it could carry. She ran the operation alone with a tricolor Australian shepherd named Rye, who had come to her as a pup from a neighbor's working litter 4 years before, and who had learned the rotation paddocks as fluently as he had learned the word for each by watching Vera walk them. Rye moved the flock when Vera moved the netting, staying low and wide on the bird's flanks in the particular cast an experienced shepherd learns from an experienced handler. And when the day's work was done, he sat at her left boot and watched the pasture with her. The way a person who has been somewhere a long time watches a place they know all the way down. Ingrid Holst, born Ingrid Larson, arrived in Cass County, Iowa in 1947 as the daughter of immigrants who had crossed from Norway with very little and had learned to keep very little, to make it last, to prefer what the land could sustain over what the market could promise. Ingrid married Arne Holst and moved to Dunning County in 1959. In 1961, she began a turkey flock from a breeding pair of Narragansett birds purchased from a Bohemian farmer in Cedar County, crossing them over several seasons with bronze tom stock until she had a bird that was specific to the Holst place. Deep-breasted for her climate, long-legged for the pasture rotations she ran, docile enough for a one-woman operation, and with a flavor that her customers at the Dunning County Farmers Market described, when they described it at all, as the way turkey used to taste. Ingrid kept a green canvas-cover notebook she called the Flock Book. Every breeding pair was recorded there. Every health observation, every rotation date, every note about how one year's birds compared to the last. She kept the book from 1961 until Vera took over in 1989, and she died in 1991, leaving the notebook on the kitchen table under a canning jar of dried thyme, as though she had simply stepped out for a moment. Vera extended the book the same day she buried her mother. She has not missed a year since the 80 acres broke down this way when Dale Marsh came to visit. 22 acres of divided rotational pasture where the flock moved in an 8-week cycle, never returning to the same paddock before the forage had recovered. 40 acres of dryland row crops to break even, and the remainder in windbreak, lane, and the old farmstead buildings her father had maintained with a philosophy toward repair over replacement. The house was the same one Ingrid had cooked in. The smokehouse at the back of the yard was the same one her grandfather had built from river limestone. The Flock Book was on the kitchen shelf, now 3 volumes, the first in Ingrid's careful hand and the last 2 in Vera's. Let me tell you what Dale Marsh was working from, because he was not wrong about the market. He had a degree in agricultural economics from the University of Nebraska, and the numbers he carried were real. The commercial turkey industry had consolidated aggressively since the 1992, and the consolidation had followed the logic that consolidation always follows, which is that a larger and more uniform supply is easier to process, easier to price, and easier to project than a smaller and more variable one. The broad-breasted white bird had come to dominate that industry for reasons that were genuinely rational inside the system's own logic. The bird could reach 38 pounds in 16 weeks. It converted feed to mass efficiently. It could be processed on a high-volume line, and high-volume lines are what processors built because high-volume lines are what the grocery supply chain needed. And the co-op's contract at 88 cents per pound live weight was, in 2016, a fair price inside a system where scale was the margin and predictability was the product. Dale was sincere about this. He was not a bad man. He had spent 20 years watching small operations struggle to compete on commodity terms and had concluded reasonably from the evidence available to him that the way to help a small operator was to connect them to a system that could absorb their production at volume. The folder he brought to Vera's farm contained market projections that were accurate for the market they described. The market they described was not the market Vera was in, but that was not a fact that appeared in the projections. He walked the pasture with her before he made his case. He asked about the rotation schedule, and Vera explained it in the same plain terms she used for everything. He looked at the birds for a while and made a note on his clipboard. When he finally said that the co-op needed her to transition to broad-breasted whites if she wanted to stay contracted, he said it with the measured regret of a person who knows what they are saying will not be welcome, and says it anyway because they believe it is correct. Vera listened. She said she'd think about it. She was thinking about Ingrid's Flock Book. She was thinking about a 1963 entry about a breeding tom selected for leg quality. She did not say any of this to Dale, because there was no point. He drove back out the lane and filed his visit report and moved on to the next farm, and the next, and the next, and the co-op's contracted supply of broad-breasted whites grew through that fall and into the following spring. Her neighbor, Walt Dewar, contracted with the co-op that same fall. Walt was 59 years old, with a good farm and a practical disposition, and the contract made sense to him the way it makes sense when the math is clear and the risk looks manageable. He borrowed to build 3 pole barns on his place. $180,000 in construction alone, plus $34,000 in ventilation, and $22,000 in the feeding equipment the contract specifications required. $236,000 financed over 10 years. In March of 2017, he stocked his first 1,800 broad-breasted white poults and began the 16-week cycle the way the handbook said to. Vera restocked her Narragansett Bronze flock that same spring with 58 poults hatched from her own breeding pairs. She put them on pasture at 3 weeks of age and began rotating them through the divided paddocks on the 8-week schedule Ingrid had worked out and Vera had refined across 30 years. She charged them nothing extra that year. She simply worked. Let me tell you about the heritage turkey. Because the mechanism matters, and it is not nostalgia. The Narragansett and the Bronze belong to a group of breeds sometimes called standard bred turkeys, which means they develop their bodies before selective pressure toward maximum breast mass and minimum maturation time reshaped the commercial bird into something that cannot reproduce naturally and cannot stand for long periods without stress on its legs and chest. The broad-breasted white is an engineering achievement, and a genuine one, if the specification is mass per week per square foot of indoor space. The heritage bird is an engineering achievement of a different kind, one whose specification was written not in a breeding program document, but across several decades of selection. For what lived, what foraged, what thrived on a specific piece of land. The Hulst Narragansett Bronze Cross took 28 weeks to reach slaughter weight against the commercial bird's 16. That 12-week difference is not lag. It is, in the precise biochemical sense, the development of intramuscular fat. In a fast-growing bird, muscle fibers accumulate mass rapidly, and the fat that distributes through them, the marbling that carries flavor compounds, does not have time to deposit in proportion. In a heritage bird that has been walking pasture for 28 weeks, foraging native grasses and clover and the insects that live in them, those fat deposits develop slowly and bind flavor compounds that are simply absent in a bird raised entirely on prepared feed. The difference is not sentimental. It is chemistry. It is the same principle that separates an acorn-fed ham from a corn-fed one, the same principle behind the difference between a Kobe and a feedlot steer. Time is the ingredient that industrial efficiency cannot purchase without changing what it is producing. What Vera's rotation added to this was not dramatic. It was not a revelation even to her. She had learned it from Ingrid, the way she learned to keep the flock book, by watching and doing and recording. 8 paddocks of roughly 2 3/4 acres each, fenced with portable electric netting, that Vera moved on a cycle timed to the pasture's recovery rate rather than to any external calendar. The birds spent 8 weeks on one paddock and then were moved. The old paddock rested for 56 weeks before the flock returned, enough time for the soil to process the nitrogen the birds had deposited, for the grasses and forbs to grow back, for the insect populations to rebuild. The birds that went back to a rested paddock were not walking into bare, scraped dirt. They were walking into a pasture with 12 to 18 inches of mixed forage, with earthworms and crickets and beetles, a diet supplement that no prepared feed could replicate. The carotenoid content of fresh forage, particularly the xanthophylls in green grasses and clover, deposits directly in the subcutaneous fat of an animal that consumes it over a long enough period. In a bird, at 28 weeks on mixed pasture, that deposit is visible to the naked eye. Vera could tell the difference in the skin color before the birds were dressed. The fat ran yellow. The commercial bird, finished on corn-based ration in a climate-controlled barn with no access to living forage, ran white. The yellow was not a cosmetic difference. It was a record of what the bird had eaten and what its meat would taste like. It was the pasture, made visible in fat. This distinction between yellow fat and white fat was not something Dale Marsh's model measured, and it was not something the co-op contract had a line for. This distinction between yellow fat and white fat was not something Dale Marsh's model measured, and it was not something the co-op contract had a line for. In 2018, Dale stood at the front of the co-op's annual membership meeting in the Ag Extension Building on the edge of Kearney and addressed what he called the co-op's strategic direction. He had a slide deck and a pointer and the calm, fluent manner of a man who had given this talk before. He said that some of their members were running what he called nostalgia operations, boutique and museum-grade livestock, that the market simply was not structured to reward at volume. He did not say Vera Holst's name. There were 11 other members in that room who knew which operation he was describing. Vera was not there. She had not attended the co-op annual meeting since 2016. She had birds to rotate. What Dale did not have on his slide deck, because no one had yet built a slide deck that could contain it, was the following. In October of 2017, a woman who owned a small cheese and specialty food shop in Omaha had driven to the Dunning County Farmers Market on the recommendation of a friend who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at a Holst household the year before. She bought 2 dressed Narragansett Brawn birds at $14 a pound dressed weight, which was the price Vera was charging that year to the private arrangement customers, and she put them in her shop's refrigerated case with a handwritten card that said simply, Pasture Heritage Turkey, Dunning County, and gave Vera's phone number. Both birds sold within a day and a half. The shop owner called Vera the following February to ask about reserving birds for the next November. Vera said she would see what she could do. Walt Dewar's first full year of production had returned him approximately $44,000 in gross revenue against debt service and feed and mortality costs that had consumed most of it. He had the barns. He had the contract. He had a plan that required several more seasons to turn the margin in his favor, and he was a patient man, and this was the rational expectation. The third barn was running at 92% occupancy by the end of 2018, which was ahead of the co-op's own projections. Walt was doing what he had set out to do, and doing it carefully, and the only thing he had not yet encountered was the thing that careful planning cannot prevent. If you have ever watched a quiet method and a confident system run parallel across the same landscape for several years, waiting to see which one holds, you understand the particular quality of those middle seasons. There is no drama in them. There is only accumulation. Marta Holst drove out to the farm in June of 2019 with a food science degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a quiet unease about what her grandmother was doing. She was 27 years old and had spent 4 years studying animal science and food chemistry, and the logic Dale Marsh had laid out at that annual meeting was essentially the logic her coursework confirmed. Efficiency was rational, scale was the path to sustainability, and sentiment was the enemy of good management. She did not say this to Vera directly. She helped with the flock, moved the netting, kept the daily records in a new volume of the flock book under Vera's instruction. She told herself she was assessing the operation, which was something. There was a moment on a Tuesday in August when she and Vera were moving the netting from the 4th paddock to the 5th, and Vera stopped at the far corner and stood still for what felt like a full minute, looking at a stretch of ground near the fencing where the grass had a different color than the rest. Marta waited. Vera crouched down and turned over a handful of soil and looked at what was in it. She said, without looking up, that the earthworm count in that corner was down from the last rotation. She said it the way she said most things, as a fact that required no emphasis. She made a note in the flock book that evening and adjusted the rotation interval for that paddock by 4 days the following cycle. Marta stood beside her and watched her write and did not say anything. What she found herself doing by late summer was watching the birds, specifically watching the difference between how Vera's Narragansett bronze crosses moved across the pasture and the way the broad-breasted whites in Walt's nearest barn moved when she walked by the ventilation grating on the south side. Walt's birds were large and fast-growing and could not be sustained on pasture for practical reasons of leg and breast development. Vera's birds covered ground at a deliberate pace with their heads working, pecking and turning and moving continuously, the way birds move when they are genuinely foraging rather than simply waiting for the feeder to cycle. The difference was not subtle. Marta wrote it down in the flock book and did not yet know what to make of it, but she was a food scientist and she had spent 4 years thinking about what animals eat and how what they eat becomes what they are, and the writing down was the beginning of knowing. There was a moment in October of 2019, not dramatic, when Marta found herself rereading the 3rd entry in Ingrid's original volume of the flock book. It was a note from 1963 about a breeding tom Ingrid had selected, not for size, but for what she called leg quality, because her pasture rotation required a bird that could travel and that the quality of the meat depended on movement. Ingrid had written it in the plain declarative sentences of a woman who had no reason to persuade anyone and every reason to be accurate. Marta sat with the notebook for a while. She went back to helping with the rotation the next morning and did not mention it. If any of this sounds familiar, if you have ever found yourself rereading something an older person wrote and realized they had already figured out something you were still arguing about, then you understand where Marta was in the fall of 2019. The winter of 2020 passed without event. The county's commercial turkey operations ran their cycles through March and June and September. Walt finished his 2nd full year of production in reasonable shape, the debt service coming down on schedule. Vera kept the flock book and moved the netting and sold a portion of her birds each November through the Dunning County Farmers Market and by private arrangement to a growing list of households in the county who had bought from her for years. At Thanksgiving of 2020, Marta stayed at the farm. She helped dress 3 birds the week before and slow-roasted one in Vera's oven on the holiday itself, following Ingrid's recipe from the flock book's back pages. Simply seasoned, low heat, a long rest. The flavor was not subtle. It was the kind of thing that makes a person stop mid-meal and think a thought they cannot immediately put into words. Marta put it into words in the flock book that evening, a single sentence in the margin of the November entry, 3 words she underlined once, tasted the difference tonight. That was all she wrote. It was enough. By spring of 2021, Marta had begun corresponding with 2 food science researchers at the University of Nebraska about the lipid profiles of pasture-raised versus confinement-raised heritage turkey breast meat. She had not told Vera she was doing this. Vera found out when Marta showed her the initial data and asked if she could take tissue samples from the next slaughter lot. Vera said yes. Ramona Peck, arrived at the Holst farm on the 12th of July, 2021, without calling ahead. She was the executive chef and co-owner of a restaurant in Omaha called Millard and Grain, and she had heard about Vera's birds from a Kansas City chef who had sourced them through a circuitous chain of farmers market contacts the previous November. She drove the 200 miles from Omaha in a car that was not new and wore a chef's jacket with a cigarette burn on one sleeve, which Vera noted without comment. Ramona walked the pasture behind Vera for 40 minutes without asking many questions. She asked how long the birds ran. Vera said 28 weeks. Ramona said nothing for a moment. She watched the flock moving through the far end of the 7th paddock, heads down working the grass the way birds work, ground they have not seen in 2 months and are taking full advantage of. Then she asked to see a dressed bird. Vera had 4 in the cold room from the spring slaughter held over for testing. Ramona held one for what felt like a long time, examining the fat cover and the skin color, pressing the breast with 2 fingers in the way a chef presses meat when they are reading something that has to be read by touch. The fat was yellow. The skin had the color of good cream. Ramona turned the bird over and looked at the back and at the leg joints and set it down carefully on the cold room shelf. She did not rush. She asked if she could cut a piece and eat it cold. Vera said the kitchen was through the back door. What happened in Vera's kitchen was not dramatic. Ramona ate a cold slice of heritage turkey breast with a little salt, standing at the counter, and set down her knife, and was quiet for what felt like a considered moment. But Marta, who had come in from the barn to refill her water, stood near the back door and watched, and did not say anything. Then Ramona asked the question. "How many can you put aside for Thanksgiving?" she said. "And what do you want for them?" Vera said she could put aside 30 birds for a November delivery, dressed at $9.75 a pound. Ramona said yes, without negotiating. The price was $9.75 per pound, dressed weight, against the co-op contract's 88 cents per pound live weight. These 2 numbers do not exist in the same market. They describe 2 different things being sold. One is a commodity and one is a result, and the difference between a commodity and a result is the 28 weeks, the 8 paddocks, the yellow fat, and the flock book. Late in the summer of 2021, Dale Marsh called Vera on a Tuesday afternoon. The co-op was entering its fall planning cycle, and he was checking in with non-contracted members. The call was brief and, on his end, genuinely friendly. He asked how the operation was going, and Vera said it was going fine. He said he thought she was still the only non-contracted turkey producer in the county, and she said that was right. He said, and he meant it, the way a person means something they have said enough times that they no longer hear it, that she was running a museum. Vera, not a business, and he meant it respectfully. Vera thanked him for calling and said she had birds to check on. She hung up. In October of 2021, Marta sat down at the kitchen table with Vera after supper and opened the ledger she had been keeping through the season. She had spent 2 hours that afternoon putting the year's numbers into the final column: 118 birds sold in the 2021 season, 22 kept back for the breeding group. Average dressed weight across the lot, 15 8/10 pounds. Average price received per pound, $9.75. The number she wrote at the bottom of the column was not the gross revenue figure. It was the per bird figure, because that was the number that meant something when placed against the comparison she had also written on the page. She slid the ledger across the table and pointed to the line. $154 per bird, dressed. Vera looked at the number for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet in the particular way a kitchen is quiet when the only sound is the refrigerator's hum and the tick of the propane wall clock Ingrid had bought in 1974, and that still kept perfect time. Rye got up from the corner and came to sit at her left boot, the way he did when she was very still, and put his chin on her knee. Vera put her hand on his head. She did not say anything. She did not need to say anything. The number said it. Marta looked at her grandmother, and then at the ledger, and then at her grandmother again. Vera lifted her eyes from the page and looked out the kitchen window at the pasture in the October dark, where nothing was visible except the amber rectangle the window light threw on the grass. She kept her hand on Rye's head. $154 per bird, dressed against the co-op contract's $24.64. Across the county that same fall, Walt Dewar's operation was running its fourth season. His per-bird gross on the co-op contract was $24.64 per bird at 88 cents a pound, and an average live weight of 28 pounds. He had good barns and a working contract and a debt load that was now down to $194,000, which was progress. He was not in trouble. He was in the position of a man whose plan was working on its own timeline, which is a reasonable position to be in when the risk you have not accounted for has not yet arrived. The risk arrived in March of 2022. The H5N1 strain of highly pathogenic avian influenza moved through the Central Flyway that spring with a ferocity that the commercial poultry industry had not seen in a decade. The first detections in Dunning County came on a Wednesday. By Saturday of the same week, Walt Dewar's 3 barns had been placed under quarantine. By the following Tuesday, all 1,800 birds were gone, depopulated, under the federal control order, the state veterinarian's truck in the lane before 7 in the morning. Walt stood in the yard. The USDA indemnity was 60 cents a pound live weight against the contract price of 88 cents. The math of the difference mattered less than the math of the whole season. The growing costs already spent, the contracted revenue now absent, the debt still present. Walt did not lose the farm. He is a careful man, and he had a careful wife, and they had built enough margin into the operation to absorb a single catastrophic season without losing everything. But he lost the season entirely, and the following one as well, because restocking a depopulated operation under H5N1 protocols required a waiting period and a biosecurity rebuild that took until the fall of 2023 to complete. Vera's birds lost nothing. The Narragansett Bronze flock ran at roughly 6 birds per acre across the 22 pasture acres, a density the pasture rotation required, and that also happened to be a density at which the kind of contact transmission that drove the H5N1 outbreaks in confinement operations was vanishingly unlikely. The birds lived outdoors. They were not congregating at shared waterers in confined spaces. The H5N1 strain that moved through the waterfowl flyway passed over the Holst pasture the way weather passes over a roof. The birds did not notice. The co-op's contracted turkey supply across Dunning County collapsed that spring. The county had 5 other commercial turkey operations with co-op contracts. All 5 were hit in the same 2-week window, as the infection moved through the shared ventilation patterns of confinement, housing the way fire moves through a stand of trees that have grown too close together. The combined losses across those 5 operations ran to over 12,000 birds. The combined debt load of those 5 operations remained precisely what it had been in February, because debt does not depopulate when a flock does. The co-op's field director spent April on the phone with processors and wholesale buyers trying to explain a shortfall that had not been in any projection, and spending a considerable portion of May trying to figure out what he was going to say to the operators he had contracted, whose barns were empty. There had been a question in the months before the H5N1 outbreak about whether the Hulst operation could be regarded as a viable model. The question had been asked primarily by Marta in her correspondence with the university researchers, and by the specialty food community in Omaha that was growing increasingly interested in Vera's birds, and by no one in the county extension system or the co-op's planning documents. After March of 2022, it was asked by nearly everyone. Dale Marsh drove out to Vera Hulst's farm on the 14th of May, 2022. He came in his clean white pickup and parked at the end of the lane and walked down to where Vera was moving netting in the third paddock with Marta Rye, circled out to check him, and came back to Vera's side. Rye. Dale stood at the fence for a moment, watching the birds work the grass with the particular, deliberate energy of a Narragansett on good pasture. And then he said, the only thing there was left to say, "How do you do this?" he said. Not as a question about technique, as a question about something else. Vera glanced at Marta and then looked at Dale for a moment. She said they could come up to the kitchen if he wanted to see the flock book. He stayed for 2 hours. He asked questions about the rotation schedule, about the breeding selection, about the way Ingrid had developed the cross over 3 decades. He asked if the genetics were documented anywhere beyond the flock book. Marta told him about the university lipid profile data. He wrote things down in a small notebook he pulled from his jacket pocket. He did not make any more projections. When he left, he shook Vera's hand and said he thought he had some reading to do. He meant it. There was no gloating at the gate. Vera went back to the paddock and finished moving the netting. Marta walked with her. Rye ran the fence line and came back, tail working steadily. The 3 neighboring operators who had watched the commercial flock depopulations that spring came to Vera one at a time through the summer of 2022. The first was Gwen Prater from the farm 2 miles west, who had not been in the co-op contract, but had been watching Walt's operation with interest and had been close to signing when the outbreak came through. Gwen arrived on a Saturday morning with a notebook and sat at Vera's kitchen table for 2 hours, asking about the rotation schedule, the breeding selection criteria, the feed supplements, the slaughter timing. Vera answered everything she asked plainly and without inflation. The second was Pete Sorensen, who had been in the co-op contract and had lost 400 birds in the March depopulation, and was rethinking his operation from the foundation. Pete sat at the same table 3 weeks later, and Marta walked him through the lipid profile data alongside Vera's notes, and he left with a breeding pair and a photocopied section of the flock book's rotation log. They came carefully, without ceremony, asking good questions. Vera sold breeding pairs from her flock to Pete Sorensen and to a third operator, a younger man named Carl Hebert, who had taken over his father's place 2 years before and had not yet committed to a production system. Carl did not have the right pasture configuration yet, and Vera walked his ground with him for an afternoon in early August and told him what to change before he stocked. She did not charge for the afternoon. She gave each of the 3 a photocopy of the relevant sections of the flock book, the parts about rotation, timing, and breeding selection, and told them to call Marta if they had questions about the records. By the following November, Marta had photographed all 3 volumes of the flock book on a flat scanner borrowed from the county extension office and had typed the text into a document that she printed, bound and filed with the university's Agricultural Archive in Lincoln. She sent a copy to Pete Sorensen and Carl Hebert and Gwen Prater. She kept the original notebooks in the kitchen under a canning jar on the shelf where Ingrid had left them, in the place where the notebook had been sitting when Vera came home from burying her mother 31 years before. The reservation list for the 2023 season opened in the first week of July. Ramona Peck called on the third day and placed a reservation for 14 birds, which was the largest single reservation. The waiting list for the 2024 season began forming the same week, which was a fact that would have been difficult to explain to Dale Marsh in September of 2016, and was completely legible to him by October of 2023, when he called Vera to ask if she would be willing to speak at the County Extension's Small Farm Resilience Conference the following spring. Vera said she would think about it. He said he hoped she would. The chef reservation list in July was not the point. The waiting list was not the point. The per-bird figure of $154 standing against the contract bird's $24.64 was important, but it was not quite the point either, or not the whole of it. What the flock book recorded, what Ingrid had started recording in 1961, and what Vera had continued, and what Marta was now continuing in a typed document, accessible to anyone who asked the university for it, was not simply a production record. It was a record of attention. 62 years of watching one particular piece of ground and one particular line of birds and learning incrementally what that specific combination required. That kind of knowledge does not transfer well across the distance between a spreadsheet and a pasture. It lives in the details. In the note about a 1963 breeding tom's leg quality, in the observation about how the birds move on rested ground versus worked ground, in the fact that the fat runs yellow and not white, and that the yellow is not coincidence. There are two ways to know something about a turkey. One way is to know everything that is true about every turkey, averaged and quantified and placed into a model that optimizes the relationship between feed cost and slaughter weight at scale. That is a real kind of knowledge, and it is genuinely useful for the thing it is designed to do. The other way is to know one flock on one piece of ground over 60 years. In the kind of detail that requires a notebook and a willingness to correct yourself and an understanding that the ground and the birds are teaching you something if you pay close enough attention. Those two kinds of knowledge are not in competition with each other, but they are not measuring the same thing, and when they stand in the same field, they produce different birds. What is rigid brakes when the pressure comes? What is specific and attentive and deeply rooted in one place has already adapted before the pressure arrives, because adapting is what it has always been doing. That is not nostalgia. It is not a museum. It is the oldest and most practical thing, paying attention over time to what actually works. In July, when the phone rings at the Holst farm, Marta answers it now. She keeps the list in the flock book, in her own handwriting, in the same green canvas cover format Vera bought at the hardware store in Kearney. She uses the same notation system Ingrid used, adapted for a larger operation and a broader buyer network, and she adds a column Ingrid never had, one listing the name of the chef, the restaurant. The list for November runs to 3 pages. On the porch in the evening, after the birds are settled and the netting is checked, Vera sits in the same chair she has sat in for 40 years, and rye lies at her left boot, and the light goes amber across the pasture the way it does in July in Nebraska, long and low and patient, and the flock moves slowly through the 7th paddock, heads working, covering the ground the way birds cover ground when they have everything they need and time enough to find it. Some things outlast the system that dismissed them. Some things were never built for the system in the first place.